I'm Julie. I'm a senior UX researcher, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman with blonde hair wearing a blue Windows XP holiday sweater, and in my background is a bed and some pictures.
Hey everyone, I'm Grace. I'm a principal researcher here at GitHub. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a white woman with brown hair and glasses. And I'm wearing a GitHub holiday sweater, and in my background is a neon Octocat sign that is not working right now.
Grace and I are going to talk today about how to evaluate, not validate. And I'm going to talk about two companies you're probably familiar with, Kodak and Blockbuster. For those of you not familiar, Kodak was a leading camera manufacturer, and Blockbuster was a national DVD and VHS rental chain. And why are we talking about these two companies specifically? Well, let's talk a little bit about what they had in common back in the 90s and early 2000s. First, they were both reigning market leaders in their industries, and they both invested in emerging technologies. Kodak created the first digital camera way back in 1975 and continued producing them into the early 2000s. Similarly, Blockbuster was also ahead of their time and actually created an on-demand video service in 2000. And as you probably know, these companies both later went bankrupt. So what happened? It sounds like they were doing everything right. Why didn't they succeed? Kodak and Blockbuster both continued to believe that their initial value prop was enough to keep their customers. Instead of investing more in digital cameras with the rise of camera phones and social media, Kodak prioritized their traditional cameras and work on photo prints. Similarly, Blockbuster doubled down on physical store locations and divested in on-demand video or streaming services. This gave companies who pivoted as customer needs changed the leading edge. Other camera companies focused on digital cameras, and phone makers integrated digital cameras into phones. Companies like Netflix, whose primary business model was mailing DVDs to customers' homes, pivoted to streaming. And these weren't always easy pivots to make or endure. Netflix specifically had originally wanted to create a Netflix box that customers could use to download movies overnight to watch the next day. And in 2005, Netflix was ready to launch this product. However, at the same time, YouTube had just launched. The folks at Netflix noticed people were willing to trade video fidelity for convenience and speed. This caused Netflix to actually stop their launch and pivot to a service that would allow customers to stream movies remotely instead of downloading them, which over time became wildly successful. The fact that Kodak and Blockbuster stuck with continuing to improve their products instead of pivoting shows they likely weren't evaluating the landscape, trends, or their competitors. And even if they were doing these things, they doubled down on their initial value props instead of allowing new data and changing landscapes to affect their roadmap. Grace and I proposed that Kodak and Blockbuster were victims of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to confirm what we already believe to be true. We're going to talk more about how confirmation bias can interfere with conducting quality research and how you can avoid falling into this very common trap. A critical step is recognizing your bias. First, it's important to remember that you are not your user. We all have different preferences, experiences, expertise, and other factors that greatly affect how we use and understand products and technology. In order to accurately understand our customers' needs, we need to actually talk to other people. We also need to recognize that the questions we ask throughout our research can be biased and need to be framed neutrally. Instead of asking what customers love about GitHub, we can dive into what they like, dislike, or find frustrating or confusing. We can also ask customers how they are currently solving their problems and how GitHub compares to other solutions. We want to get as objective of answers as we can about GitHub and our products. To do this, we need to be open-minded about our products, designs, prototypes, and customers. Even when giving a prompt to an AI like ChatGPT, confirmation bias can creep in. Let's take the age-old debate of tabs versus spaces. Here we have a prompt for ChatGPT. If I phrase a question to ChatGPT, asking it to explain why tabs are better, it will give me a lot of great reasons. But if I phrase it as, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using spaces versus tabs in coding, it will give a much more nuanced answer. I'm going to hand it off to Grace to dive into some specific tips on avoiding confirmation bias and how to effectively conduct evaluative research.
Thanks, Julie. So now that you know more about different types of biases and how to recognize them, let's talk about how we can transition into a more evaluative mindset. So to help you get into this unbiased mindset, it's important that you frame your research goals and questions in a way that optimizes for learning over confirmation of pre-existing beliefs or assumptions. And one really simple way to do this is just to seek to evaluate rather than validate your research questions. When your goal is evaluating a hypothesis, this mindset actually trickles down to the questions that you ask participants, and it helps you to ask those non-leading questions. So I don't know if you all remember statistics that you may have taken in high school or college, but if you do, maybe you remember hypothesis testing. So in hypothesis testing, you start with a null hypothesis, which states that there's no difference between two groups, for instance. And you also have an alternative hypothesis, which is typically what the research is trying to find support for. But even when the null hypothesis is rejected, we don't say that our alternative hypothesis is true. Instead, we say that we fail to reject the null hypothesis, which is actually a triple negative. And this is because the evidence doesn't prove that the null hypothesis is true. It just shows that there's not enough evidence against it. Similarly, in user research, we want to stay open to alternative explanations for our findings. And one way to make sure you're in this evaluative mindset is to write hypotheses that are testable. And part of making a testable hypothesis is defining measurable outcomes and thinking through the objective criteria that is either going to support or refute your hypothesis. So let's go back to the tabs versus spaces coding example that Julie mentioned. If you were to create a hypothesis around this comparing the two, and you said, spaces are better than tabs for coding, that is not a testable hypothesis. Because how do we define better? It's too ambiguous and it's open for interpretation. But if you were to say using spaces for coding indentation leads to fewer syntax errors compared to tabs, you can actually imagine how you might go out and measure that criteria by, say, counting syntax errors. Another way to help us stay open to alternative explanations is to attempt to invalidate our hypothesis. This makes your research more rigorous because it forces you to go deeper and consider other factors. For example, if you're trying to invalidate your hypothesis, you might look for alternative reasons for your findings. For instance, maybe you only spoke to one type of customer, or maybe all of the participants lived in the US and other cultures weren't represented. Whatever it may be, seeking to invalidate your assumptions makes you think more critically. Here's an example I love that illustrates this concept. Some of you might remember this example before. So let's say I gave you a 3-number sequence and I said, I have a rule in mind for these 3 numbers, and I want you to try and figure out what that rule is. You can propose your own set of 3 numbers, and I'll tell you if it either follows my rule or it doesn't follow my rule. Most people, when they see these numbers, propose sequences like 3, 6, 12, or 4, 8, 16, and I'll say that their numbers do follow my rule, which just kind of reinforces their idea of what they think the rule is. But if they ask if the rule is doubling numbers, they would be wrong. It's only when people start proposing numbers that break their own mental model of what they think the rule is, for instance, 3, 2, 1, that they start to get closer to the truth. I'll say that doesn't fit my rule, and eventually they'll figure out that the rule is just sequential numbers. This is once again an example of confirmation bias that Julie mentioned earlier. And so you can see why attempting to invalidate your hypothesis can be so powerful in helping you get closer to the truth in user research. So now that you're in the right evaluative mindset, I want to give you a few practical tips and tricks for your next research study. The first one is to write out your assumptions and hypothesis before you conduct the research. This includes listing not only what you suspect is true about customers, their behaviors, their motivations, but also what you believe might not be true. So you could be exhaustive and write out both positive and negative hypotheses. And doing this helps us avoid hindsight bias, which is when after conducting research, we feel like we already knew that insight beforehand. Then after you conduct your research, you can revisit those hypotheses and assess whether it was validated or not validated. This also keeps us honest and stay true to our original research goals. Next, we want to avoid cherry picking research findings. One way to do this is to include other people in your research. Your peers, for instance, they usually have a fresh perspective and a view on the observations. And after each research session, you can debrief with those folks and reflect on what you just learned with the other observers. You can sense make with each other and make sure that you all have the same understanding of what you just heard and you're not cherry picking the findings. Another tip is to triangulate different research methods. So data from a variety of sources makes our findings much stronger and less susceptible to confirmation bias. For example, you can use interviews, surveys, telemetry data, all in conjunction to investigate your research question. Another tip is to test your ideas and your hypotheses early. We tend to be really attached to specific design ideas if it's early in the less attached to specific design ideas if it's early in the process, whereas if it's later, you may have already invested a lot of time and effort into it. And we have one last tip for you. Even when you're getting data early, you still want to look for evidence that might contradict your hypothesis. When looking at telemetry data, for instance, you could still easily fall into the trap of only searching for data that validates your initial assumptions. So to break out of this, consider conducting research on extremes. For example, if you're working on GitHub repos, you could gather data from customers who have thousands of repos and then data from customers who have very few repos. Looking at data in this way helps us to be more exhaustive and to consider different user scenarios and different use cases. So to wrap up, we want to mention that all research will have some type of bias. It's impossible to eliminate it completely, but we can conduct high quality research by recognizing our biases and by framing our research goals in a way that sets us up to be open-minded. So like we discussed, this includes seeking to evaluate rather than validate, and also to consider alternative explanations to findings. And if you're looking for more help or resources from the customer research team, please check out our customer research Slack channel. We also hold office hours multiple times per week, and we have a lot of self-serve resources in the customer research repo, which includes a lot of templates. In particular, we have FigJam templates, one of which is our alignment exercise, which actually helps you with writing out those assumptions, your hypotheses, and your research questions. Thanks again for listening.